Great. Okay. Well, welcome everyone to the latest event in this Bletchley Park Week. When, as you'll know, we're in the Bletchley Park Week, we're taking a different look at the histories of the Second World War, and I'm very pleased to welcome as our speaker for this lunchtime session, Professor Wendy Webster, who's going to be talking about the book she published in 2018 with Oxford University Press called "Mixing It: Diversity in World War II Britain." But I should also just say, by way of background, that Wendy is Professor of Modern Cultural History at the University of Huddersfield, and she's published very widely on 20th century British history, most recently with her book, but before the current one, Englishness and Empire, most relevantly, I should say, to our topic, 1939 to 1945, which was the winner of the International Association for Media and History Prize, and was also published by OUP in 2005. And she tells me that she's currently now working for as a historical consultant with Lenny Henry on a play he's writing for TV called Three Little Birds. I should just also mention that we are now recording this this lecture, and do please leave your microphones muted. But with no more ado, I'll hand over to Wendy, and thank you very much indeed for joining us today.
Thanks, Tom, and thanks to Yasmin for inviting me. I gather Yasmin's moving today, so that sounds an onerous thing to do in a pandemic. And thank you to everybody for coming, and to Shabazz for doing the techie stuff. So Shabazz, can I have the first slide, please? Okay, so this is a wartime poster showing allies from Britain from all over the world. On the left, we have the Empire allies. On the right, we have much of the rest of the world, including much of Europe. And the same wide range of allies were also present in Britain during the war. So the war saw a large-scale migration of peoples to Britain on a scale that was unprecedented, a remarkable migration. Britain had experienced migration from across its empire and the world for centuries, but the migration in the Second World War was of a new order of magnitude. And can I have the next slide, please? Because this is one rather nice comment from a wartime arrival on what she saw in London. This is Major Charity Adams, who was the first African-American woman to be commissioned as an officer in the US Women's Army. She was commander of the 688 Central Postal Unit. And when the unit arrived in London in January 1945, this is what she commented. So every conceivable kind of uniform could be seen on the streets, worn by all races, colours, sizes, sexes, shapes, and religious persuasions. She also commented that the English drove on the wrong side of the road. And this diversity that she noticed was not confined to London. It could be seen across all the nations and many of the regions of the UK. And I'll say something about the Highlands and Islands of Scotland later, because I was very struck by what I saw there on a recent trip. People came to Britain for many different reasons. Many were servicemen and servicewomen like Major Charity Adams. And can I have the next slide? Because you'll see here some other Americans arriving, nurses. So obviously a very wide range of nurses arriving. 500,000 Canadians also sailed to Britain. And in 1940, as Germany invaded and occupied much of Europe, 6 European armies in exile arrived. Those of Belgium, Czechoslovakia, Holland, France, Norway, and Poland. And that too was completely unprecedented. Others who arrived were refugees, exiles, war workers, these nurses, other nurses, Irish nurses, nurses of all nationalities, and prisoners of war. Those who arrived as refugees and exiles were mainly from occupied Europe, and a lot of them came in 1940, some of them on their own initiative. Most refugees from Germany and Austria, the majority of them Jewish, had arrived in the couple of years before war was declared. So these large-scale movements meant that people mingled and mixed in Britain across a range of national and racial boundaries. And they did so in a variety of public and private places, on buses, on trains, in the forces, in workplaces, hospitals, schools, pubs, dance halls, as well as in the domestic space of private houses. So I'll move on now to look at three themes about factors that shape these encounters. And I've chosen to talk about language, race, and sex. So I'll start with language. I think language is really interesting, and it often receives very little attention when people write about migration, and perhaps particularly when they write about war. But it is very significant to encounters between people, I think. And the arrival of refugees, exiles, troops, and war workers does make Britain increasingly multilingual. And it also changes soundscapes in Britain. And you find a lot of people commenting on the voices that they hear, sometimes very unfavorably. So when physical markers of difference, such as skin color, are absent, it's language and speech that mark people out as different and as foreigners. It's when you open your mouth that people hear that you're foreign or that you're different. If I can have the next slide, please. It's difficult to represent sound visually, but I found this wonderful picture of Helena Dorr. She's a leading aircraft woman. She's a Pole, 23 years old when this photograph's taken. She served in the Women's Auxiliary Air Force in Britain. She'd been deported to the Soviet Union after the Soviet invasion of Eastern Poland and came out under the so-called amnesty when the Soviet Union entered the war on the Allied side. And the picture was taken in 1944. And as you can see, she's mugging up on her English, studying a Polish English dictionary. Next slide, please. This is Joe Kobach, also Polish, had no chance to mug up on his English before he travelled to Scotland to join the Polish army immediately after his arrival in 1940. And this is what he said. We were marched in column to railway station, and as we walked along platform, we noticed this writing on windows of train: smoking and no smoking. And of course, since smoking in Polish means dinner jacket, we were surprised that one has to wear dinner jacket to get into train. So we all looked for windows where there was no smoking, promptly lit up our cigarettes. I have the next slide, please. Language differences were often the source of considerable anxiety and could not only cause misunderstandings, but also provoke hostility. The extent to which attitudes to foreigners in Britain were shaped by speech and language rather than visual differences is apparent from wartime interviews done by Mass Observation, an organisation which collected information on public opinion. So when mass internment was introduced in 1940, mass internment of enemy aliens, and had considerable popular support, one person interviewed by Mass Observation commented on all those who should be interned. He said they should be all what don't talk plain English. And in a number of other Mass Observation interviews which asked about people's opinion on the subject of language, some of them identified all foreign accents that they heard in the streets as a common alien sound when they called it jabbering. So this was a kind of hostile attitude. You could hear all this jabbering in the streets. It didn't sound like England any longer. It sounded like some foreign place. And labels given to non-English speech included mumbo jumbo, as well as jabbering. So a view of English as a civilized language above other languages had a considerable history. White Australians often labelled Aboriginal speech noisy jabbering. And Leonard Peake, an Australian airman in wartime Britain, gave the jabbering label to Welsh speakers he encountered when he was posted to Penrhos in Wales. He wrote in his diary, "The Batmen are funny. They jabber away in Welsh like a party of abos." And he made a similar comment in his diary about French airmen. There are a lot of free French about. The mess is full of their jabbering. So his comments suggest that many English-speaking people regarded English as more civilized than other languages and lumped all other languages together, including the non-English languages of Britain, so Welsh in his case, hearing them as unintelligible and alien jabber. So language, a very significant role in encounters between people of different nationalities and in ideas of English superiority to them. I'm moving on now to look at some of the racial dimensions of this history. And in this slide, you can see some of the African Americans who arrived, around 130,000 of them. And these soldiers are in Northern Ireland. So the first contingent of American soldiers actually arrived in Northern Ireland. And a wide range of people of colour from the British Empire also arrived to serve in the forces and do war work. As early as 1940, there was some media coverage of their presence. If I can have the next slide, please. A BBC radio series called In It Together included an interview with a Sikh flight lieutenant of the Royal Air Force, and interviews with New Zealanders included one with Henare Ngata. I don't know if I'm pronouncing that right. He was of the Maori Battalion of the Royal New Zealand Expeditionary Force. And Indians in the RAF and Maori contingents also featured in newsreels in 1940. One on the Indian Air Squadron commented on their loyalty to the Empire and called them magnificent types of men. And the one on Maori contingents from New Zealand in Britain called them Dominion troops, fine Dominion troops, like their white compatriots. What this coverage failed to mention, sort of celebrating their arrival in Britain, was that at the beginning of the war, regulations on recruitment to the armed forces in Britain ruled that unless men and women were judged to belong in the racial category pure European, they were insufficiently British to serve in the armed forces. Can I have the next slide, please? So the RAF rule stated that only men who are British subjects and of pure European descent are accepted. And similar rules are applied across the British Army and the Royal Navy. And this is Porokuro Poe. And I've seen his application form to join the RAF. And it's actually to join the RAF in New Zealand originally. And it's very striking when you see when you actually see the question, which says, are you of pure European descent? It's just very boldly there. And he wrote no. If I can have the next slide, please. There's no way of knowing what Porokuro Poe felt, but Dudley Thompson has written about how he reacted to this question. I saw that one of the questions on the form was, are you of pure European descent? I wrote yes, because some of my friends had been turned down because they were not, and they were told so. There was a difficulty, particularly in the early stages of the war, getting in if you were coloured. I thought this was bad, really bad. This was stupid. This was prejudice, really wrong. So I said yes, because I wanted to fight. I wanted to fight against that. The colour bar in the RAF was lifted very quickly in October 1939, and Porokuro Poe came to Britain. I got really interested in him because he then participated, he was captured and participated in the so-called Great Escape. However, a bar against women joining the ATS, which is the women's branch of the British Army, wasn't lifted until much later. It was only late in 1943 that the War Office conceded that a limited number of black women from the Caribbean could come to Britain to join the ATS. Before that, they'd said, quote, "We cannot agree to accept coloured women for service in this country." And in fact, when the war was over, the rule barring recruits who were not of pure European descent was reinstated in the army briefly. As early as 1942, the War Cabinet were anxious to make sure that those who were in Britain shouldn't stay when the war was over. So it noted, quote, the serious social consequences might arise from the demobilization in this country of any appreciable numbers of certain classes of coloured men who were serving in His Majesty's forces. But he also noted that they couldn't be deported because they had a right of settlement as British subjects, and so they recommended covert discrimination. If I could have the next slide, please. What they wrote. The only course open to us is to recommend very strongly that service departments should do all they possibly can by administrative action to reduce to a minimum the opportunities these men might have of being demobilized in this country. And covert discrimination is probably more typical of the British government than anything overt. This was obviously a very confidential document. If I could have the next slide, please. These will be West Indian technicians arriving in London, pictured looking happy and celebratory, but at the same time, the Ministry of Labour took a similar view of their war work when the war was over, saying it would be undesirable for them to remain in this country. Despite all this, the story of a progressive Britain, in contrast to a racist America, was told a good deal in wartime Britain. There was much public criticism of the racial segregation of the American armed forces, but none from the government wanted to keep their American allies sweet. A lot of criticism from people in Britain that America segregated its forces, but that was actually in the context where colour bars in Britain did operate across a range of other places, hotels, boarding houses, some dance halls and pubs. And moving on to sexual relationships and race, again, the story of a progressive Britain against a racist America was told in protests and petitions about death sentences for Black GIs convicted of rape. Rape didn't carry the death penalty in Britain, but it did in America. And Americans were in charge of what happened to their troops. So these protests were prompted particularly by the view that the American practice smacked of racial discrimination and racial persecution. When Leroy Henry was condemned to death by American court-martial for his alleged rape of a British woman in 1944, a petition started by a local baker collected 33,000 signatures. Next slide, please. The story of a progressive Britain against a racist America, which obviously is still being told. The story hasn't died out altogether. It was told in stories about interracial mixing as well in the war, including mixing between white British women and Black men. This was not only accepted, but also championed by a significant strand of popular opinion. It included mixing in dance halls, as you see in this slide, involving physical contact. But popular opinion was usually ambivalent or wary about interracial sex and marriage, and often outright hostile to it. So a distinctive feature or a distinctive view of interracial encounters, which was taken by many white British, managed to marry those two, the defense or championship of mixing with hostility to interracial sex and marriage, by arguing that such encounters should be friendly but brief. In dance halls, physical contact should be strictly confined to the dance floor. Black men were often accepted as allies in a common struggle and valued as members of the Allied community. But in wartime, as well as in the aftermath of war, they were rarely accepted as sexual partners or husbands of white women. And tensions were by no means only about interracial relationships. What I've called sexual patriotism was a frequent requirement of women, but not of men. They should avoid any sexual relationships outside the national collective, not only with enemies and black men, but also with white allies. The British jibe against Americans is well known, that they were overpaid, oversexed, and over here, but it wasn't directed particularly at African Americans, but at white Americans. And virtually any transnational sexual relationship could prompt his hostility. Some reports were on concerns about, quote, the increase in moral laxity, particularly of married women whose husbands are abroad with Dominion and US troops, and the view that, quote, there will be mass murder unless the government gets them out of the country before our men come back. And in fact, the men who were out there serving overseas knew or came to know, or a lot of them came to know what was going on at home. And in their letters, they expressed a lot of anxiety about it and hostility to those kinds of relationships. One wrote, I wonder what will happen with all the girls who've married their foreigners when the time comes for the foreigners to go home. That's one thing that makes the British troops here bitter against the colonials, as so many of them here have had their wives clear off with the Canadians. And you know that Canadians and Australians were often referred to by the British as colonials. Another soldier wrote to his wife, I don't suppose you'll even think of doing it, dear, but don't let me ever hear of you talking to a Yank. I'd chop your legs off from under you if you ever did. So no bloody Yanks mind. Sexual relationships that cross national and racial boundaries were also a main cause of inter-allied violence in Britain. British-Polish fights were caused by Polish men's relationships with British women. And Robert Murray from British Guiana, who volunteered for the RAF in 1944, said that the West Indians were disliked for one major reason: always women, always girls, always the white men not wanting their women to fraternize with those blacks. It was this singular thing that caused fights. So the requirements of sexual patriotism clearly came in very different versions by gender. The requirement for British women was loyalty to British men, and women who flouted those requirements lost any claim to be patriotic. I'm going to finish with something on memories of the war and take you briefly to the Highlands and Islands of Scotland for this. The Highlands and Islands of Scotland are often advertised to tourists as remote, untouched wilderness country and as places of timeless beauty, especially the islands. So perhaps they're the place where you'd least expect to find a big history of movement, of migration, of interracial and transnational mixing. Can I have the next slide, please? This is Polly Balderramas and Nadia Kattoos, and perhaps they are tourists. Photograph of them standing obviously in front of the village sign, and they're in uniform. Balderramas served in the RAF from 1942, and he was on leave when the photograph was taken, and visiting Kattoos, who was in Edinburgh serving in the ATS. So she'd arrived after the ban on black women serving in the ATS was lifted in 1943. Perhaps they're on a day trip, or they may have stayed over. They certainly look as though they're having a good time. So they're both from British Honduras. And if I can have the next slide, please. British Honduras was then a British colony, now Belize. And Kattoos's, Nadia Kattoos's uncle, part of the reason she wanted to come to Scotland was her uncle was there. And he was called Carlton Fairweather. He was in Scotland because of its forests, came to fell trees like these lumbermen shown here, who are all working for the British Honduran Forestry Unit, recruited for the war effort. The Canadian Forestry Unit also felled trees in Scotland and had camps in the Highlands. At Inch Camp, in the Highlands, a Canadian wrote in his company's diary in winter 1944, "Wet, heavy rains, what a country. Rain isn't rationed." So bad weather then. But like the Highland forests, it was the weather to some extent that brought people there from other countries, especially the weather in the Cairngorms. And that was particularly because of Norway. So Norwegians trained in the Cairngorms for work in something called the Special Operations Executive, which was a secret British organisation operating in occupied Europe to aid resistance movements. So they were training for sabotage and raids on occupied Norway. I may have felt at home in the Cairngorms because the weather in winter there is often blizzards and freezing temperatures. The landscape is snow-clad mountains and the skiing and reindeer, just like Norway. So a good place to train to do sabotage, although since they come from Norway, perhaps they don't need much training for that environment. And if I can have the next slide, please. This is a bit more linking Norwegian history to the Highlands and Islands of Scotland. This is a memorial in Scalloway to Norwegians who died serving on the Shetland bus. The Shetland bus was the name given in Norway to the traffic plying to and fro, taking agents to assist the Norwegian resistance from Shetland and bringing back Norwegian resistors who were being hunted down by the Nazis. And the ships were crewed by Norwegians. I found this story about Arild Riptol, whose father was a resistance leader in Norway with an urgent need to escape. So Arild Riptol arrived in Britain as a boy on the Shetland bus after a voyage in a ferocious storm. He remembers that after 3 days and nights, his mother said, "Guess where we are?" And he remembers her saying this, quote, in a voice happier and clearer than I'd heard it since before the war. And he also remembers that he answered without hesitation, "England." He comments, close enough, it was Lunaboil in the north of Shetland. Can I have the next slide, please? There's also a memorial to Norwegians in the Cairngorms, Norwegians who served in the Special Operations Executive. So this memorial reads, "This stone was erected by the people of Badenoch in honour of the gallant company of Norwegian patriots who live among them and trained in these mountains." And next slide, please. Indians were also in the Highlands because of Norway. In their case, this was because of Winston Churchill's plan to open a second front in Norway. It was decided that animal transport units were needed for his plan, and there were none in the British Army, which wanted to be modern and mechanised and had dispensed with animals. The Indian soldiers had arrived in Marseille via Bombay early in the war, working with mules and horses, and you can see some of them behind them there. So they arrived there because there were fears of a repeat of the Western Front of the First World War and all that mud. And then they were then evacuated from Dunkirk and the mules were left behind. Once in England, they were re-equipped with mules and then moved around from Cornwall to Wales and finally to the Highlands of Scotland, trained to go to Norway. But their animal transport units never got there because that version of a plan for a second front came to nothing. And the next slide will show you some of the graves where they're buried in Kingassy. Can I have the next slide, please? And there are others buried in Dernoch. Most of them were Muslims. And services of remembrance are held at Kingassy Cemetery, and some visitors go there to see the Indian soldiers' graves. There are calls for a permanent memorial in Scotland to the contribution that Muslims, Sikhs and Hindus made during both World Wars. Can I have the next slide, please? This is a memorial in Arisaig in the Highlands to Czechs and Slovaks who served in the Special Operations Executive, with an inscription in memory of all of them. And next slide, please, which shows you Achnacarry House. People of many different nationalities trained as commandos in the Highlands of Scotland at Achnacarry House. And in this slide, it's 3 French soldiers who are marching in front of Achnacarry House. Next slide, please. Those who joined the commandos and passed through the Highlands during training included Belgians, Dutch, Norwegians, Yugoslavians, as well as French. And here are Dutch troops training at Achnacarry in a blizzard, as you see. Next slide, please. Next slide, please. Sorry. Finally, an image with which many of you will be familiar, a beautiful chapel on the Orkney Islands, which is now a major tourist attraction and was built by Italian prisoners of war. So an amazing diversity of people in the Highlands and Islands of Scotland. Finally, memory then. A number of memorials in the Highlands of Scotland to people from all over the world who served in the British war effort. I was very struck when I visited the Highlands by how many there were. But there's much about this history of people from all over the world serving in the British home front that isn't widely remembered. I've got just a brief list of maybe random things. Who now remembers that there were Indian pilots and black pilots from Africa and the Caribbean serving in the RAF? Who remembers that technicians from India and the Caribbean were recruited to do war work in Britain? Or that Indians and Caribbeans broadcast at the wartime BBC? And I haven't said anything about the wartime BBC, but it was very, very multinational and multiracial during the war. We remember Dunkirk, but not the subsequent evacuations, which brought many Belgian, French, Slovak, and Polish troops and civilians to Britain, or the many Europeans who made their own way, acting on their own initiative. Who now remembers that when the war began, there was a rule barring people from joining the RAF and the army in Britain who were not of pure European descent? So a lot of forgettings. Persistent anti-Semitism in Britain. Again, I haven't mentioned that in this talk. Again, it's generally forgotten. Memory is selective. Britain is a country of sanctuary for children who came on the kinder transport and were predominantly Jewish is widely remembered, but not the subsequent introduction of mass internment of enemy aliens, including the internment of some of the older children who'd come on the kinder transport. Who now remembers that many Irish people of neutral nationality served in the British forces or came to Britain to do war work or as nurses? Who now remembers the people of enemy nationality, German and Italian, who served in the British forces, did war work and broadcast at the BBC? Or the many German actors who worked in wartime British cinema, most of them Jewish, and many of them fated to be cast as Nazis? And I could go on with that list, but I'll stop. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you very much indeed, Wendy, for that fascinating talk and a perfect contribution, I think, to our Bletchley Park week and reminding us of all sorts of things that either we've forgotten or maybe didn't know at all. So that's really interesting. I'll throw it open in a moment to general comments, but could I just kick off by asking about the very interesting point you make about the British government advocating covert discrimination, in effect. You talked about administrative actions, and I wondered if you could give examples that you might have found of that, what that would mean in practice.
Well, those two, the one about the return of West Indian war workers, which is made at the end of the war, is also about covert discrimination. Another example would be at the end of the war, the New Zealand government is going to say openly in its legislation about immigration that that no people of colour will be allowed in. And the British government advised them it might be wiser not to put that openly, because in fact it's quite easy to turn someone down after interview without an explanation being given.
Yeah.
And the same kind of thing was mooted in relation to the RAF, that it would be easier to turn people of colour down after interview without giving them an explanation. So don't have an open policy where you know, where it's clear that you're not going to admit, but do it in an underhand, cover way.
Great. Okay, well, we've got a few minutes for discussion, so let me throw it open. So if anyone has a comment or a question for Wendy, then you can use the hand signal function. So I'm not used to Zoom, so I'm not quite sure where to look for.
They use the chat, Tom, if that helps. People can type their messages.
Yes, that's probably easiest if you could put something in chat. What was it that drew you to the Highlands in particular, Wendy? I mean, I was in Arisaig myself the year before last. Yeah. And it's a beautiful spot, and of course all those little houses, the kind of farmhouses up and down that coast were full of SOE people up to all sorts of strange. And Gavin Maxwell teaching them how to skin seals and that kind of thing. But it's a remarkable place, and you see the various memorials there to the national groups. What was it that got you initially interested in that as a particular?
Well, I suppose the Second World War memorials, and there are a lot of them. So I think there are really a number, aren't there?
Yeah,
and
indeed,
you don't.
Indeed.
Yeah, and so I think if you're looking for memorials of some of this history, local places are often better to go to than expecting national memorials. Actually, you know, the number of national memorials to Europeans who fought is quite limited. But if you go to the Highlands and Islands of Scotland, then you get a number of local memorials.
Yeah, I see we've got a few things in the chat now. So from Louise, who says, given the levels of racism towards African Americans in America, did many stay in Britain after the war? Or were there administrative barriers to that happening?
There were administrative barriers. Nearly all the African Americans went back to America, and it's some of that history is quite interesting, again, in relation to what I was saying about this progressive idea of Britain against a racist America. Because in fact, some of the African Americans who go back do have a favourable image of Britain by contrast with America. So that is interesting. And in the 50s, some of the a particular African American magazine has a sense that, you know, Britain is an ideal place where marriage, sexual relationships between African Americans and white women are, you know, totally accepted. And that's kind of wrong, because that's not the case, but clearly that was some of their experiences.
Great. And from Yasmin, great talk. Why was all this forgotten so soon after the war? A very good question.
It is a very good question, that. And I think it's not just Britain that forgets its allies. So that is kind of everywhere, certainly in the media. If you look at the Soviet Union, France, America, Britain, they're all at it. They're all just sort of developing a narrative where they win the war single-handed.
Quite.
So that's not unique to Britain at all. I think there is that sense of victory, isn't there? There is a kind of perhaps there's a wish to forget the war immediately it's over. People are very weary. I mean, obviously later on the war becomes a huge part of British memories, and there's a lot of investment in the idea of the war as a symbol of national, or the result of the war, I suppose, as a symbol of national greatness. But maybe immediately the war's over, people do want to forget. They want to get on with their lives to some extent. And again, I think there's a lot more local memory, perhaps, of that history than there is national memory.
That's interesting, because that fits in with another question from Melissa Hawker, who thanks you and says, do you have any advice on how to find these histories in our local areas?
Yeah, I think if you sort of search in local archives and local newspaper archives, particularly. So in Huddersfield, where I work, the local newspaper is called the Huddersfield Daily Examiner, and they have a lot of stuff during wartime, you know, about different groups that were in Huddersfield. And that history, you know, say in Huddersfield, there's a Polish church. So I think, yeah, I would look in local media, first of all, I think, both at the time and perhaps since.
Yep.
The Huddersfield Daily Examiner also carries articles about some of the people, you know, who are still in Huddersfield and what they're doing now and so on, and their memories of the war. So yeah, I think that would be my starting point, but also obviously local archives would be a good place.
Indeed, indeed. And another one from Louise. I also wondered, given the huge diversity of people fighting on the Allied side, are there recorded reactions to that diversity from the other side?
From the German side, is that what it means? The enemy side, enemy.
Yes, the enemy side.
Yeah, I mean, so the enemy side is also quite diverse, isn't it? You know, the Germans recruit all kinds of different nationalities into their armed forces. So it's almost like, I think German propaganda targets Brits, doesn't it, with the idea that the Americans are getting their woman, and particularly Black Americans. So they use the sort of diversity of the Allied side to try and make Britons fearful. So that sort of whole history of fears that, or British men's fears about other people having sexual relationships with, quotes, their women, is actually used by in German propaganda. So Germans are clearly aware of, or German propagandists are aware of that.
Yeah. And so I'd missed one of the question from JRC. What if a volunteer was rejected as a soldier?
On racial grounds?
I think so, yeah. That's I suppose might be what other options were there if you were, you know, to support the war effort and that kind of thing. If you were rejected as a soldier, I'm not sure what lies behind that.
No, I mean, so Porokuru Poe, I mean, I suppose if you're rejected in September, he applied in September, the rule is then changed in October, so presumably you could reapply then. But I mean, Dudley Thompson just says yes, doesn't he? Are you European descent? Yeah. So I think there is quite a lot of toing and froing going on in that period.
Yeah.
But rejection would be a very difficult experience for people, wouldn't it? Obviously, you know, the whole point of them volunteering, they are volunteers, they want to fight. And then to be rejected when you've been told that you're part of the British Empire and you're British.
That's right.
And then you're rejected from British forces.
That's right. And
good experience.
From Maya, hi, thank you for the great talk. Was this rejection only in the military?
Oh no, I don't think so. There's a sort of varied history, isn't it? There's one woman who was rejected by the Women's Land Army, and that caused a stir. That point I made about how a Calabar operates across hotels and boarding houses and other places. There's a report that comes out at the end of the war which says, you know, this is practiced quite widely, this Calabar, but people don't know about it. Or it doesn't come to public attention much. And there's that famous case of Leary Constantine being refused a place in a hotel that he booked in advance. You know, and he's a famous Indian cricketer and so on. So yeah, there are lots of areas, I think, where people get short shrift because of their race. Yeah. It's not confined to the forces.
Indeed. And
on the other hand, sorry, but can I just say that, that there is, in wartime, there is probably I don't know, racism sort of goes underground much more. I think there is a sense that we are fighting, you know, a racist state, and therefore, you know, people have to be a bit more, you know, if they want to be racist, they tend to be a bit more covert about it.
Yeah. And Melissa Harker has another question of whether, do you have a sense of how, how the colour bar was applied or not to those of mixed heritage?
I think I'll have to pass on that one. I haven't really thought about that.
Okay. And Tamina M, thank you for such a thought-provoking talk. I'm interested in the idea of the changing soundscapes with international recruitment. Could you say anything about the challenges of linguistic diversity during the war years and how this might have impacted on collaboration?
Collaboration. Wonder what she's got in mind there.
We might need an extra an extra.
Can you just say the first part of the question again, Tom?
Interested in the idea of the changing soundscapes with international recruitment and the challenges of linguistic diversity during the war years. And she meant by working together, not collaboration in the
collaboration in that way,
not in the pejorative sense. Yes.
Yeah.
So,
yeah.
Did that impede working together, I guess? So,
yeah. I mean, I think the best example would be the BBC, where there are huge numbers of people recruited joining the BBC because the BBC extends the number of languages in which it broadcasts. I don't know, from about, I can't remember how many there are at the beginning, about 8 to about 47. So, you know, they're broadcasting a huge range of different languages. So there are all these different people at the BBC. And yes, there is working together that goes on a fair bit, I think. So people write script together. There's quite a big friendship between a Chinese guy, whose name I won't attempt to pronounce, and the Indian Mark Rajanand, the Indian novelist. And they work together on scripts for programs. The Eastern Service brings in people from India, Sri Lanka, which was then Ceylon, wasn't it? Uyuna Marson from Jamaica is part of the Eastern Service. Zulfikar Bakari, there's a wonderful picture of him, which I should have put on the slideshow, really, working in the BBC Home Guard. So the BBC Home Guard is also sort of got a certain element of diversity in it. So that, they're kind of all work together, and I think there is a lot of collaboration going on between those guys.
A question from JRC. I think this is for Emma probably, but thank you so much for the talk. Really great. Can we find this talk in a YouTube channel to rewatch? It would be wonderful. But I think because we're recording, then I think it will be available on the college website, I assume.
Yes, our comms team will sort of edit it, and then the links for all the talks this week will be available on our website.
Brilliant. So rest assured it will be available. Okay, well, I think with the prospect of being able to review it on the college website, I think we probably should leave it there. I know our time's almost up. So thank you very much indeed for those questions, and thank you above all to Wendy for a fascinating talk. And thanks for joining us. We have one more event tomorrow when I think the subject is going to be 1984. Dorian Linsky talking about that. But until then, let's leave it there. And thank you very much indeed, Wendy. I'm sorry, it's hard to give a round of applause, but you're getting kind of round of applause in the chat. Everyone is saying thank you. So that's terrific.
I've enjoyed it. Thank you very much.
Good. Well, thanks so much for joining us.
Thanks for inviting me.
Okay, right. Goodbye, everyone.